All right, so over on Fox News, they actually had a pretty honest moment for a change and pretty much came out and said the quiet part out loud about one of my core critiques of the capitalist mode of production. So, credit to Case Study QB for finding this clip for us. It's only about a minute long, so I'm just going to go ahead and play it, and then I'll give you guys my thoughts after this.
So we have an overheated labor market right now, and it's because of what the Fed did, but also, fiscal stimulus disincentivizing people from going back to work. And right now we're in this situation where employees have more leverage over employers than they ever have. And it's kind of counterproductive to capitalism. And I think over the course of the next several months, several quarters, the Fed is going to be forced to have to reset the labor market. They're going to have to reset equilibrium. Just a quick story. Took my kids skiing to the local ski resort in Cleveland over the weekend. They're trying to, at the ski resort, they're trying to hire high school kids to work concession stands for $20 an hour. And they can't get high school kids to take that job. I think I was working for $5 an hour in high school. Now, that was a long time ago.
So it's not just the wages, but it's also saying, I want to work from home. Yes. I don't want to come in 2 days a week. I want...
Okay, so there is just so much to say about that. All right, obviously the last part of that was just absolutely awesome. They're like crying and pissing and shitting their pants over the fact that they can't exploit child labor of high schoolers. But anyways, skipping over that, the main point of what he was saying there, the crux of what he was saying there was kind of a contradiction at the beginning, right? Because he starts off by saying, well, we have this problem with the Fed policy and they really need to get us back to equilibrium. And what he means by equilibrium in that sense is he basically thinks that workers having any leverage whatsoever within their workplace is a problem, and they need to be crushed. They need to be put back in line so that they can simply be cogs in the machine instead of actual human beings who can collectively fight for better wages, better benefits, safer working conditions, etc. Okay, that's what he's talking about when he says return to equilibrium. He means give 100% of the power in our economy back to the capitalist class, back to the authoritarian leaders within what is inherently sort of a dictatorial system where you have a top-down approach with a handful of executives or even a CEO or a single owner at these companies who get to make 100% of the decisions for the company, and the average workers have absolutely no say or pushback in any way, shape, or form. Okay, that's what he defines as equilibrium. Okay, not like workers having a union and thereby being able to have a collective voice or anything like that to offset the power and the decision making of a lot of these CEOs whose only priority is to ship off money to Wall Street. Not that type of an equilibrium where the power balance between workers and owners is somewhat even, right? He's talking about equilibrium as if like the owners of these companies should have all of the power. Okay, so that in and of itself was kind of hilarious, right? But then he contradicts that by also implying that we have a problem where nobody in the American economy wants to work because something fiscal stimulus, and they got a couple of checks back a couple of years ago for $1,400. Maybe we had the child tax credit and these basically crumbs that were dished out to average Americans, especially over the course of the pandemic. And he's simultaneously, as he's complaining that workers have too much power right now in the economy, he's also saying that they're lazy and that we don't have enough of them to work, which is a contradiction, right? Either you have an overheated labor market, which basically by the capitalist definition of that means you have too many people who are employed and wages are too high, which isn't even necessarily accurate under his own definition. But that also gets to a good point there, because what he's admitting is that capitalism inherently as a system, in order for them to see it as thriving, they need to have more people pushed out of the labor market, which, believe it or not, even as insane as his characterization of the current state of the American economy actually is, this is perfectly in line with what the Federal Reserve has already openly said. I mean, hear from Jerome Powell. They say cites top barrier to taming inflation, workers' wages. Okay, and this comes after, just a couple months before this, that Jerome Powell once again said that his goal with his Fed policy was to get wages down for average workers. Okay, this is what the Fed policy is. And again, it gets to a fundamental lesson here about what our country is all about, right? About what it looks like to have a government that is not a functioning democracy, but is a government that purely exists exist to serve the interests of corporate America and the billionaire class. That's what they do, right? So it's not even just these right-wing, conservative ghouls on Fox News over here. It's also within, the Federal Reserve, for example. It's also within the Biden administration. All these motherfuckers have the same opinion when it comes to what we should do to address inflation. And some very key, pieces of data here that were left out of that conversation, right? Because again, he's trying to imply that the problem with inflation and why we can't seem to get it under control in a reasonable amount of time is because workers have too much, leverage, or maybe their wages are too high or something like that, right? But he's not talking about shit like this, which I think may disagree with the underlying point of what he's trying to say, right? So here from The Guardian, this one is back from August of 2021, so slightly over a year from now, but they say American CEOs make 351 times more than workers on average in like a one-to-one comparison, your average worker's salary versus a CEO salary, right? 351 times more than workers. And in 1965, it was 15 to 1. Okay, so in other words, during the predominantly neoliberal era of the American economy, right, over the last couple of decades, we have seen skyrocketing inequality, not just in wealth, but also obviously in wages between the top 0.1% or 1% versus the bottom 90%. Okay, that is what has been the broad characterization of how the American economy has been doing over the last number of decades. Okay, so kind of leaves this part of the equation out, doesn't talk about the fact that we have seen, CEO pay skyrocket by over 1,000% over the last number of decades. No, he's complaining because a couple of thousands of workers across the country over the last couple of years have mildly more leverage within the economy because it's a slightly more tight labor market, or because some people have managed to form unions in their workplace and they have some leverage to push back and try to get better wages, better benefits, better working conditions, right? He's complaining about that while completely just glossing over this because, of course, under his, definition of what capitalism should be looking like, this is perfectly fine. This is perfectly normal, nothing to look at, nothing to complain about here, right? Just another piece of data here from Forbes. Again, this is from a couple years ago, but it holds true today. They say top 1% of U.S. households hold 15 times more wealth than the bottom 50% combined. I'm sorry, what? Okay, so you look at the current state of the American economy, right? They're saying that you take the bottom, 150 or so million Americans in this country, total up all of their wealth, multiply it by 15, and then you'll get to the wealth that the top, 3 million people in this country hold? I mean, it's a complete fucking joke. And this doesn't even get to, other points like this about how productivity has been skyrocketing, since basically like the Nixon-Reagan administrations, right? There's been a complete disconnect of productivity, which has been absolutely skyrocketing, going up here, right? And hourly compensation. So in other words, workers are not being rewarded for their increase in productivity since about, the 1970s, early 1970s, right? So this is another key point here that I've used this graph multiple times on this channel, but just understand that it's not that workers are being lazy, right? It's not that average workers are not being more productive. We are more productive than at any point throughout history, right? But the wages have not been keeping up with that, and yet we still have ghouls like this guy on Fox News, and we also have people like Jerome Powell within the Fed who basically think that the problem is that this light blue line here has gone up too aggressively, right? Not the CEO pay, not the top 1%, the billionaire class, corporations, right? Just that line right there. That blue line is apparently the massive problem with inflation right now. And this, again, finishing off here, ties back to a point that Bernie Sanders and many other left-wing politicians have been making for a long time, which is that if you actually look at this, right, if you actually look at the data in terms of what have been the primary drivers of inflation, workers' wages have been 7% according to some of the analysis that I've seen. This, according to Bernie Sanders, claims that nearly 54% of the rise in inflation is directly attributable to the astronomical increase in corporate profit margins. Okay, so again, I don't know, maybe you guys are better at math or something than me, but this isn't really adding up in my head. Okay, so you have skyrocketing CEO pay, you have worse wealth inequality than during the robber baron era here in the United States. You have literally less than a handful of billionaires in this country that have more wealth than the bottom half. Okay, you have the top 1% having 15 times more wealth than the bottom 15%. You have corporations who are making record profit margins right now and are accounting for a majority, an outright majority of the inflationary pressure that we have been seeing. And instead of addressing any of those things in order to get inflation down, right? Because just in a very general, rudimentary way, if you're trying to get inflation down, you could do a number of different things. You could set price controls, for example. You could, tackle a lot of the corruption, the price gouging of some of these corporations, right? You could pull money out of the economy in, various different forms. Maybe you could go after the richest 1%. Maybe you could go after the profits of a lot of these massive corporations if you want to pull money out of circulation. But instead of doing that, instead of addressing any of these very, serious problems with the American economy and how an overwhelming majority of the American people are literally living paycheck to paycheck, the solution from our government, the solution being proposed by, in many circumstances, Democrats and Republicans and political commentators like that guy on Fox News, their solution is to go after workers. Their solution is to target and pummel and crush the people who are on the bottom of the ladder. Okay, so again, to some extent, I almost kind of appreciate them speaking like this openly and just saying the quiet part out loud and describing why capitalism is an unsustainable system and how our government has just been completely corrupted by corporate America and the billionaire class, because there's absolutely no way that this would be the Fed policy, that these would be serious conversations that people were having if we actually lived in a true democratic system.
Everyone is saying good Politic guy has the best Politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me. Everyone is saying